Hey guys, thank you so much for joining back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the cell. And in future lessons, we're going to be talking about different cellular processes and different organelles that are found within the cell. So just as an overview of the different organelles that are in the cell, we have our nucleus, our nucleolus. You also have the endoplasmic reticulum that surrounds the nucleus. And on this endoplasmic reticulum, you have ribosomes. And these can also be free floating within the cytoplasm. And that's just the liquid that's found within the cell. You also have Golgi bodies or Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, vacuoles and lysosomes, and centrioles. Now I know I just zoomed through all of these organelles, and that's fine because this is just a basic overview, and I'm going to be going into much more detail about each one of these organelles and what their processes are. So don't worry if you weren't able to catch up on this. By the way, our last few lessons on macromolecules are extremely important to be able to understand what happens within these organelles. So make sure you review those videos if you don't understand what's going on. So the first part of the cell that I'm going to be talking about is the cell membrane. And as I mentioned before, your cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. So let's write that out, a phospholipid bilayer. And when we look at the specific structure of our phospholipid bilayer, which I've drawn out here, you have your polar head, which includes your phosphate group. So you have your polar head, which includes a phosphate group. And you can remember it's a phosphate group because you have this phosphorus atom. You also have your glycerol backbone, so you have your glycerol, and ester bonded to the glycerol, so you have your ester bonds. You have a fatty acid chain, and this fatty acid chain is much longer than the one I've drawn. It's just a bit easier to visualize. And so when we draw out this this phospholipid, it's generally drawn out with the phosphate head with two fatty acid chains. Now, when we were talking about this in our lipids lesson, we mentioned that this was amphipathic. And what amphipathic means is that you have a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end, or one end that loves water and one end that repels water. And so, as fatty acids are nonpolar, this is your hydrophobic end, and your polar head is your hydrophilic end because it's charged. And so how does this help the cell membrane in regulating what goes into the cell, what goes out of the cell? Because your polar heads are facing outwards, you have that extracellular interstitial fluid made up of water and other different proteins, nucleic acids, and organisms. And so that can occur on outside the cell. And within the cell, you have your cytosol, which is also made up of water. But you also have this hydrophobic middle region. And what this ensures is that there's no way for the cytosol or the interstitial fluid to mix. Now that said, we're going to be talking about the different parts of our cell membrane that allow certain functions in the cell, and these are extremely important. So lipids are not the only macromolecule that is found in the cell. We also have proteins. And so I'm going to be labeling out what these are and what their functions are. But before I go into that, there's two main types of proteins that are found on the cell membrane. You have integral proteins, and these are found that across the membrane. So here you would have an example of an integral protein. And you'll have peripheral proteins, or ones that are just loosely bound to the outside of the cell membrane. And so this would be a peripheral protein. You also have glycoproteins. So let's say this is an example of your glycoprotein. And glyco would allow you to remember that it has a carbohydrate attached to it. And so this is our carbohydrate that is attached to our protein. Now the functions of these different proteins include intercellular joining. So when you have tissue made up of multiple different cells, it allows those cells to join together. They also have enzymatic activity, transportability, so transporting ions or water. Aquaporin is an extremely important example of an integral protein that allows the movement of a certain molecule across the membrane. You also have cell-to-cell recognition, and so glycoproteins are extremely important in this, and you have those carbohydrate chains that allow for this to happen. And finally, you also have signal transduction. And again, integral proteins allow this to happen, so these transmembrane proteins allow the signals to pass through. And so I'm going to label out, you have your glycoprotein, integral, or transmembrane protein, and you have your peripheral protein. In addition to proteins, we have glycolipids, and these are basically lipids that are attached to a carbohydrate, and these are attached by a glycosidic covalent bond. So I'm going to write that out. Bond. And again, this is a covalent bond. And what this allows is it allows the cell membrane to both be stable, but it also allows for cellular recognition, similar to our glycoprotein. So you also have cholesterols that are integrated within the cell membrane, and what this does is it adds some rigidity into the cell membrane and makes it less permeable to certain molecules so that they can't pass through the cell membrane. So now that we have these different molecules that are integrated into the cell membrane, we have a good idea of what this cell membrane is made up of. Let's talk about the function of the cell membrane. So a very obvious one is that it protects the cell from its surroundings, so no macromolecules, viruses, bacteria can enter the cell. In addition, and this is extremely important, the cell plasma membrane is selectively permeable. So it only allows certain types of molecules to pass through freely, while ions and charged molecules and even larger molecules such as carbohydrates can't really pass through the cell membrane very easily. And so it allows the regulation of different substances in and out of the cell. Again, your integral protein, your transmembrane protein, allows for certain ions or polar molecules such as water to pass through the cell membrane. And you also have those different signal transduction proteins that allow the signal to be signaling molecules to go into the cell. Now specifically you have endocytosis and exocytosis. And so this is the process of things moving into the cell and certain molecules moving out of the cell. So in this example, let's say you have a protein that needs to be sent out of the cell, and we have it inside a vesicle. And so a vesicle has the same structure as your cell membrane, your phospholipid bilayer. And so what occurs is your cell membrane fuses with the vesicle. So as it moves towards the cell membrane, it fuses with the vesicle and allows this molecule to enter or leave the cell. So it can either have the outside of the cell and the cytoplasm here, but it could be the complete opposite, where your cytoplasm contains this vesicle and you're moving it outside of the cell. So this is called exocytosis, and this is called endocytosis. So moving it inside the cell is called endocytosis. So now we've kind of gone through the different functions, parts of the cell membrane, and at this point, let's go over a summary of what we've learned. So the cell has a selectively permeable cell membrane that is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. But within this phospholipid bilayer, you have many different structures. So you have cholesterol, different types of protein, including integral and peripheral proteins. You also have glycolipid and glycoproteins, which allow for cell signaling or cell-to-cell recognition. You also have the functions. The functions of integral proteins are the movement of certain ions or certain polar molecules in and out of the cell, such as water in aquaporins. And your peripheral proteins have many different functions, such as cell-to-cell binding. We also have cholesterols that are found within the cell membrane, and these allow for the rigidity of your cell membrane. And the functions of the cell membrane, again, are to regulate what goes in and out of the cell and to provide a structure to protect the cell from its surroundings. Thank you, and join next week to learn about the mitochondria and other parts of the cell.